On Halloween night, Chester, Lena, Cecil, and Christy dared each other to enter the haunted Hollow Woods. They stumbled upon an old mansion, but when darkness fell, they unleashed an ancient curse that would change their lives forever. The air was thick with the scent of earth and something else, a faint trace of smoke, as if the forest itself exhaled memories of old fires. It was Halloween night, and 4 friends, Chester, Cecil, Lena, and Christy, stood in silence before the mansion that loomed ahead. Though the sky was without a single cloud hiding the moon, the shadows were unnaturally dark, like pools of ink that collected around the edges of the forest path. "Are we sure about this?" The naked fear in Lena's voice was barely more than a whisper. She shook her arms around herself, feeling the creeping chill seeming to seep from the mansion's broken windows and crumbling stones. "It's Halloween," Chester replied, though even he sounded uncertain. His eyes were fixed on the towering structure as it suddenly took on a life of its own in the night. Always the brave one, always leading the way in all their childhood adventures, Chester felt something wrong tonight. Cecil, ever the adventurer, was already at the door. He turned back, a curious gleam in his eye. "They say the family who lived here just vanished. One Halloween night years ago. They left everything behind, even their Halloween decorations. No one knows what happened to them." His voice dropped to a whisper, or what's still here. "Let's just get this over with," Christy muttered, trying to hide her nervousness. Always skeptical, never believing in ghost stories or the paranormal, tonight even she felt the slight prickling on her neck as if the house was watching them. They stepped up to the porch with a collective shiver. It groaned under their combined weight. Once grand but now hanging from one hinge, the door shrieked as they pushed it open into an entryway bathed in shadow. Inside the House of Shadows. The heavy door creaked shut behind them as they entered, its soft, ominous thud sealing them inside. The air was thick with dust, swimming in the thin shafts of moonlight filtering through the broken windows. Shadows seemed to cling to every nook and corner, none too willing to let go of whatever secrets they harbored. The thin, wavering beam of Chester's flashlight flickered on, barely seeming to pierce the darkness. Carved pumpkins lined the entry, their faces twisted into sinister, exaggerated grins as if mocking the group's intrusion. The reek of rot hung thick in the air, mixed with the stale scent of decay, causing Lena's gut to lurch with a gag. "This place is a graveyard," Christy whispered, barely audible over the deafening silence. "Everything's left here, just as it was." They walked in slow, careful circles around aged, tattered Halloween decorations that seemed locked in time. Spiderwebs, masks, skeletons with blank eyes, all encased in dust and neglect. A smattering of faded photographs lined the walls, documenting a family whose faces had been scratched out, leaving only the hollow outlines of heads. Cecil's eyes stayed on the photos. "You think who did this?" he whispered, reaching to touch one of the frames. The glass was thinly coated with a smudge that looked like dried blood. Lena's face had bleached white. "Perhaps we should not be here," she whispered, looking around her. But it was too late now. There was no going back. They had an unspoken agreement. They had come this far, and they would see it through. Whispers in the dark. And the deeper they went, the more the whispers seemed to be carried by the air feint, like distant voices carried upon the wind but progressively louder. At first, they thought it was just their minds playing tricks on them. But then, the whispers formed words and haunting calling out their names in such a way as to make their skin crawl. The cheater's flashlight sputtered and weakened. He swore softly and shook it. But as the beam died, the darkness grew heavier, closing in on them from every angle. Lena huddled against Chester, her hand digging into his arm as if he were some kind of lifeline. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes darting around the room. "It sounds like someone's laughing." They strained to hear, but it was gone, swallowed into the silence. Yet, an uneasy awareness of unseen company would not leave them. They would grow deadlier by degrees in a tick of time, with every breath hung like lead and every heartbeat thudding loudly clear in the quiet. Then, without warning, the quiet was shattered with a great crash. Whipping around, hearts bounding in their chests, they saw one of the carved pumpkins had fallen away from its perch on the mantelpiece, its grin now smashed on the floor as if some unseen force had pushed it. Cecil knelt down and picked up a piece of the broken pumpkin. His fingers stirred something inside, and he pulled out a small, dusty photograph. The faces in the photo were dully recognizable. 4 figures standing in the very room they now occupied. But their faces were foggy and distorted, and each expressed pure terror. Cecil's hand shook as he held the picture up toward the others. "It's us," he whispered, his voice breaking. "We're in the picture." The basement ritual. Panic set in, and they hurried down a narrow hall that seemed to twist and turn in impossible ways as if the house itself were shifting around them. They came upon some stairs leading down into a pitch-black basement, and though Lena protested, Cecil insisted they investigate. He said, "Maybe we shall find some explanation at the bottom," though the quiver in his voice betrayed his fear. They turned to go down the creaking stairs, every movement feeling like a step toward something unspeakable. The basement was colder, thick with the smell of mildew and something else, sickly sweet and rotten. Their flashlights cut across the room, revealing to them some weird setup in the middle. Melted candles arranged in a circle with broken glass and scattered Halloween masks. Lying at the center of this circle was an old worn journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. Cecil picked it up and turned the pages. The writing was frantic, almost illegible, and spoke of rituals and incantations to bind the spirits. Drawings of twisted, contorted faces lined the margins, and symbols none of them knew were scrawled in blood-red ink. "What is this place?" Christy breathed, her eyes alight with a combination of terror and fascination. "It's like a seance or something," Cecil said, barely above a whisper. "They had to have tried to contact something or keep something locked away." A loud, jarring noise, like fingernails scratching through wood, made them all jump. Of their own accord, the candles flickered to life, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls. Chester took a backward step, pulling Lena with him, but Cecil seemed mesmerized, his eyes fixed on the circle as if he were drawn to it. Without warning, he began to mutter to himself in a low, hollow voice. The words were in some ancient foreign language. They carried a dark resonance that seemed to pound through the room. "Cecil, what are you doing?" Christy's voice was sharp, angled with panic, but Cecil didn't utter a word. A glazed and vacant expression had overtaken his eyes, his face eerily spreading into a faint smile. Chester and Lena looked at each other in horror as they reached for him, trying to pull him out of the circle. An invisible force seemed to push them back, keeping them in their place. Cecil continued chanting, louder and more desperate, like he was channeling something other than himself. The shadows suddenly began to move around them, coalescing into figures, pale ghostly shapes with hollow eyes watching them with silent malice. Lena screamed, clutching at Chester's arm as the figures closed in, faces contorted in the rictus of agony and rage. "Escape!" Chester jerked Lena's hand, pulling her toward the stairs. "We gotta get out of here now!" he yelled back, though his voice was hardly heard over the whispering din of the air. Each voice called their names in tones so full of malice. She reached back, trying to pull Cecil with her. Still, he seemed transfixed. His bloodless face twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes unblinking, chanting on and on. Shadows whirled around him, merged with his outline, until he was nearly invisible, submerged in darkness. Christy cast one final desperate glance at her friend. Then she stumbled up the stairs after Chester and Lena, leaving Cecil behind as his voice began to echo through the basement, the sound growing fainter with every step they mounted. They burst onto the main floor, gasping, but the house seemed to fold over them like a trap, walls narrowing and doorways disappearing as they ran. They could feel the shadows pressing in on them, cold fingers brushing against their skin, and the whispers jamming their ears with promises of fear and pain. At last, they burst through the front door into the night, falling to the ground outside. Cold air filled their lungs, but as they turned to look back, they saw Cecil framed in an upper window, his face contorted in a way no longer human into a grotesque, unnatural smile. And beside him stood Christy, vacant, eyes hollow. Lena's voice shook. "They're gone," Lena whispered, her voice cracking as she clung to Chester's arm. Chester felt an empty ache in his chest as he looked up at the house. It loomed above them like a specter, dark and forbidding. "No, they're still in there. We can't leave them," he said, the panic rising in his throat. But as they struggled to their feet, the mansion seemed to shift. The windows became dark voids, the shadows inside pulsating as if alive. Lena's heart raced as an overwhelming feeling of dread washed over her. "Chester, we can't go back. We have to run." Slowly, he turned away from the house, drawing Lena after him. They ran along the small pathway, branches slapping against their faces. It was as though the forest was alive with the crashing and crunching of leaves, with faraway howls resounding through the night. Behind them, the whispers rose again, a haunting melody that took wing among the trees. They could hear their friends' names woven into the chorus, calling them back to the house and the darkness waiting inside. The cost of curiosity. They stumbled into the clearing, gasping and terrified, but Chester stopped as they reached the edge of the woods. "We can't just leave them," he said doggedly. "What if they're still in there? We have to try." Lena shook her head, streaming tears down her face. "Chester, they're gone. The house took them. We saw it." He couldn't shake the feeling that they should go back, but they'd have to do something. He turned back towards the mansion, its silhouette dark against the starry sky, and without a word back, he went. Lena hesitated but turned and followed, her heart pounding in her chest. They crept back toward the house, whispers louder now, more insistent. As they neared the door, the air seemed to thicken, heavy with a sense of foreboding that made breathing hard. The blackness seemed to swallow them whole as Chester pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. Down in the basement, candles still danced, casting an unearthly glow. At the same time, the journal lay open, its pages turning, it seemed, of their own accord and beckoning them closer. "Cecil! Christy!" Chester shouted, and the house answered back in eerie emptiness. Resolute, Chester and Lena began the descent down the stairs once more, the chill in the air cold with each venture down into the basement. The shadows were alive and in a wilder dance around them as a living entity. They could feel the weight of the house weighing down on them, the whispers of a cacophony around them. Madness. Asterisk, asterisk, help us. The voices wove together, chilling and seductive. Then there they were, Cecil and Christy, strangely lifeless in the center of the circle. Their eyes were opaque, their faces expressionless, as if they had been turned into vessels for whatever evil spirit dwelled in the house. "Cecil! Christy!" Lena screamed, turning to reach for them, but Chester held her back. "We can't just touch them. We don't know what's happening." The figures turned towards them suddenly, and Chester's heart fell. Their broad and unnatural smiles played with the friends they once knew. "Join us," echoed Cecil, layered in an evil hum. "We found the truth. The house. It gives us power." "No!" Lena shouted, racing her heart as she took a step backward. "You don't know what you're saying." If, in response to her fear, the shadows launched themselves forward in a wild tangle, stretching and twisting, cold fingers touching their skin. Whispers grew louder, a rising tide of despair and confusion drowning their voices. A cold dread was seeping into Chester's bones. "We need to get them out of here," he yelled above the cacophony. "Lena, we have to break the circle." The broken circle. In one great burst of courage, Chester suddenly sprang toward the circle to drag his friends from the precipice at the last moment. He reached down and snatched the journal off the ground. The pages flailed in a wild, lifelike dance. The instant he ripped it away, the shadows screamed a blood-curdling, bone-shivering sound that echoed through the basement. The walls shook, and the candles danced frantically, sending crazed shadows around the room. "Cecil! Christy! Fight it!" she cried, reaching out to them, her heart racing. She instantly saw the flicker of recognition in their eyes before the darkness consumed them again. As Chester clutched the journal, a surge of power flowed through him, coursing an energy that connected him with the spirits of the house. Opening the journal, he read the words aloud, desperate to break the curse binding them. With each word, the shadows recoiled, his friends' figures wavered, and he saw their actual struggle against the darkness for just 1 second. "Chester! Help us!" Christy's voice cut through the chaos in a tone so full of fear and desperation. "Fight it! You can do it!" Chester implored, his heart heavy with the turmoil of watching them fight the dark tendrils. But the shadows were too strong. In one final scream, it surged and enveloped Chester whole. Lena watched in horror as the house shook with high intensity, the walls cracking, the very foundation shaking beneath their feet. "Chester!" she shrieked, her voice cracking as she saw the pointlessness of their fighting. The shadows swallowed him whole, and in one last glance, he was sucked into the darkness, leaving Lena behind with the reverberation of screams. The candles went out instantly, and the basement was plunged into total darkness. Lena stumbled backward, her heart shattered as the whispers filled her ears, now mocking and taunting. Turning, she started to flee upwards, not allowing the shadows to claw at her heels to pull her back into the abyss. She burst through the front door and onto the ground, gasping, staring backward at the house. The whispers continued, a haunted melody in the air, filling it with dread. The windows were glowing with sickly light, and she could have sworn she saw silhouettes darting around behind the glass. Cecil and Christy, lost forever in the darkness.